Today on this webinar, we are going to go over a couple of different things, and then, as I said, get to the questions and answers at the end. We wanted to provide a brief introduction to those who may not be familiar with FASEB, or the Federation of American Societies for Experimental Biology. We will discuss what the 2016 election results mean for science based on what we know now. More importantly, we're going to provide an update from Capitol Hill because Congress still has not finished their current work, and there's quite a bit at stake for the research community over the next few weeks. I'm going to give you some options for how you can take action and how you can get involved and help advocate for biomedical research. And then we will have plenty of time in the end for any questions you'd like us to discuss, in particular things that we did not address during the webinar. For those not familiar with FASEB, we are a federation of 30 member societies, and collectively we represent about 125,000 researchers in the community, representing all ranges and fields of science. A majority of our members are actually funded by the federal science agencies like the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation. Our mission really is focused very squarely on the advocacy that we provide to our member societies and with our member societies. This slide shows the 30 members of FASEB. You may recognize your scientific society on this slide. I will say that our advocacy is made stronger and more effective by the participation of our member societies, so I thank each and every one of you who's on this webinar who is already a member of our societies. Before the webinar, we had solicited information about questions and issues you'd like us to address, and it was not a surprise to any of us that the number one question on people's minds was what's going to happen now that we know the results of the 2016 election. So as I think most people know, we will be, as of January 20th, operating under the Donald J. Trump administration. Right now, what's going on is a tremendous amount of work to do the transition or peaceful transition of power from the Obama administration to the Trump team. What's happening right now is the Trump transition team is working on proposed appointments for 4,000 people who must be appointed to key jobs in the administration. 1,000 of those will require approval by the United States Senate, and two that are primary to FASEB's interests are the director of the National Institutes of Health. We do not know if there will be a new director. What we do know is that President Obama has asked all of his appointees, including Dr. Francis Collins, the current director, to submit their resignation effective January 20th. This is a standard procedure when changing administrations. We don't really know what Dr. Collins plans to do, if he is asked to stay on or if he will be asked to stay on. The same can be said for the Secretary of Health and Human Services. The current Secretary, Secretary Burwell, will also need to submit her resignation. There have been a lot of rumors about who might be the new Secretary of Health and Human Services, and we don't know who it will be. We do know that Dr. Ben Carson, who also ran for president, has taken his name out of consideration for any administration appointment. This process could take several months. We don't really have a time frame. We do know that the second important criterion activity that will be taking place over the next few weeks is that the officials from the Trump administration transition team will work with and meet with the appointed agency review teams. Due to legislation passed by Congress earlier this year to ensure a peaceful transition of power, each federal agency has appointed what's called an agency review team and an agency coordinator, and this will be the staff from institutes or agencies like the National Institutes of Health, who are career officials who will meet with officials from the Trump administration to brief them on key issues. We know that these agency review teams from the Trump transition team are not yet on site at any of the federal agencies, including the Department of Defense, but we expect this process to begin very shortly. We also know that NIH has prepared several documents outlining their priorities and initiatives to be transferred and given to the Trump agency review team for NIH, and FASEB is planning to meet with the NIH team very shortly as soon as those folks are on board.
Hi, this is Ben Krinsky. I'm a colleague of Jennifer Zeitzer's at FASEB. Just want to fill in a little bit more information here about the new administration and what it means specifically for biomedical research. The question on a lot of people's minds is, what do we know about Trump and biomedical research? And the answer is, frankly, not much. It may be surprising or probably unsurprising that the NIH was barely mentioned in the course of the campaign, but the fact that it was not mentioned is not necessarily bad news. In fact, it might be good news. Things that are mentioned on a campaign, particularly a divisive one, often are the sorts of things that wind up in the crosshairs, and the fact that biomedical research wasn't mentioned, we could actually perhaps take as a positive sign. The other thing I think it's important for everyone to keep in mind is the difference between campaigning and governing. Campaigns are just one phase of the U.S. political process and are very different from the actual management of the federal government. So you've already heard from Jennifer a little bit about the process as it stands right now. We do have a little bit more information, particularly with regard to the Department of Health and Human Services. We know that their transition team is headed by a gentleman named Andrew Bremberg. He's a former staffer to Senator Mitch McConnell and Governor Scott Walker. And there's just simply a lot that we don't know. And as the old saying goes, the first 100 days will be key as the new president during the so-called honeymoon period seeks so-called quick wins to build momentum. On the congressional side of things, here's where actually things, frankly, haven't really changed very much. The Republicans retain control of the House of Representatives. Paul Ryan is expected to remain Speaker of the House of Representatives as had been before, and Nancy Pelosi is expected to remain as Minority Leader. The composition of the House is largely unchanged, with 238 Republicans. That's 6 fewer seats, actually, than they had previously, and 193 Democrats, with an additional 6 seats. There are a couple of outstanding races that remain to be decided, particularly in California and Louisiana, as you can see on your screen. But by and large, the composition of the House is the same. Likewise, the Republicans, as you know, retain control of the Senate. Senator Mitch McConnell will remain Majority Leader. And in recent news, Senator Chuck Schumer has taken over from Minority Leader from Harry Reid, who retired from the Senate as of this election. So again, we're looking at a closely divided Senate with 52 Republicans and 46 Democrats, with 2 independents. So the sort of optimistic perspective, I think, is that the prospects for NIH funding actually perhaps look good. It remains true that funding for biomedical research is one of the few truly bipartisan issues in Congress. As you'll see on this slide, there is actually some evidence to suggest that when Congress and the White House are under the control of the GOP, the NIH has fared rather well. For example, during the so-called doubling period under Speaker Newt Gingrich and John Porter from the late 90s to the early 2000s. More recently, as many of you may be familiar, we've seen a lot of effort from Republican chairs, both in the House and the Senate, to increase the NIH budget. We saw a $2 billion increase in fiscal year 16, and we are in fact hoping for an additional $2 billion when Congress, we hope, finalizes the fiscal year 2017 budget. As I said, there is some evidence to suggest that R&D funding in general does rather well under GOP presidents. This has certainly been the case under recent Republican administrations. Over the longer term, evidence seems to suggest that when we say NIH or research is a bipartisan issue, it is truly bipartisan, that science tends to come out rather well in the eyes of both Democrats and Republicans. Another thing, aside from the budget which we are keeping our eyes on, is a regulatory reform. One issue that has been of particular interest to FASEB and other scientific organizations has been regulatory burden on scientists, things that hamper the ability of scientists to do their work. And given the deregulatory philosophies of many Republicans, it's entirely possible that relief of regulatory burden might actually be something that we see go forward in the months and years ahead.
So we're reaching out to you now for a couple of reasons, not only to share information about the limited information we do have about the new Trump administration and the new Congress, but because there's still quite a bit of work to do before the end of this calendar year. In case you haven't seen your members of Congress at home lately, it's because they are indeed back in Washington. They returned on Monday for what's called a lame duck session. We don't know how long this session is going to last. Technically, it could run into January because the new Congress will not start until the old Congress formally adjourns, or I should say the current Congress formally adjourns. But increases have been proposed for science in the pending 2017 budget that Congress left unfinished when they took a break before the election to go home and campaign. All government agencies are operating under what's called a continuing resolution or a temporary budget agreement. This runs out on December 9th, so the artificial deadline for Congress to take action and finish work on the 2017 budget and any other issue is December 9th. We do firmly believe that will likely get extended until later in December. Congressional leadership has not really decided on a strategy for keeping the government funded beyond December 9th. That's both good news and bad news. The bad news is, without a plan and a deadline quickly approaching, you could get a little nervous. The good news is they're working on it. The appropriations committees have been very clear that they have done a lot of work over the course of this year, and they really want to pass the budget. They took time during the last break and worked behind the scenes to resolve their differences on the spending levels for the various agencies, which is what had been holding up passage of the budget up until now. But we also know that members of Congress are eager to wrap up this session and move on with their lives, especially those who are retiring or may have been defeated for re-election last week. So we're going to need a tremendous amount of public pressure to convince Congress to pass the budget. Without a 2017 budget or a longer-term extension of the current continuing resolution, those pending increases for the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation will likely disappear. There has been some talk that they could come back and the new Congress could pick up where they left off, either in January, February, or March, but given how much work there is to be done with standing up the new administration, there's a risk that they just don't do anything and they simply flat fund all the agencies at the 2016 level. And that would result in that $2 billion increase that was proposed for NIH just disappearing, which would be really awful. There are a significant number of members of Congress who now want to wait until Trump is officially president on January 20th to make any decisions. And for those who pay a lot of attention to what Congress does or does not do on a daily basis, their natural inclination is to push off all difficult decisions until another couple of months from now. So we really do have our work cut out for us to convince them to make that $2 billion increase for NIH an actual law. As members of the research community and scientists, you probably wonder, does advocacy, does what we do make any difference? How do we know that contacting our members of Congress will have some impact? So since a lot of folks on this call are from the research community, I thought I would throw some data on the screen here. And there have been two recent surveys from a very reputable organization in Washington. It's nonpartisan, it's a nonprofit, it's called the Congressional Management Foundation. And they exist to improve communications between congressional offices and staffers and stakeholders in the public. And what we've learned from these two surveys has been about 88% of congressional staff said that receiving an email has some or a lot of influence on members of Congress. 78% of staff have said that social media posts from multiple constituents who are concerned about a specific issue could certainly influence their bosses. The next one surprised me a little bit, which was slightly less than half of staff who were surveyed said that as few as 30 comments about a specific issue on a social media platform would be enough to gain attention from members of Congress. So that's a couple of examples of how we know that advocacy makes an impact. But I also thought I would share a story that came across our email recently that I thought was a really good way of demonstrating how you know. So Aaron Caldwell, who is a second-year PhD candidate at the University of Arkansas, actually received a message from FASEB and from a member of his society, the American Physiological Society, asking him to email his representative. So he did, and he urged his representative to support increased funding for NIH. To our delight, Representative Steve Womack, who is almost Dr. Caldwell's representative, responded to the email and also asked to visit the research lab at the University of Arkansas. So they worked together, and on October 19th, Representative Womack brought two of his aides, and they toured a research lab at the university and met with the director. And they were also able to view a video describing some of the federally funded research that was underway at the lab. So my point in telling this story is, you never know exactly when or how you can make an impact, but you should always believe that at some point it will. So I do encourage folks to take the lead from almost Dr. Caldwell here and email your members of Congress. Before I do that, though, I wanted to make sure folks know where things stand with the agencies and the proposed funding for research. As I noted, the Senate is the one that recommended the $2 billion increase for NIH, but increases have also been proposed for the National Science Foundation, the Department of Energy Office of Science, the Veterans Administration's research program, and the Agriculture and Food Research Initiative. That's the competitive research program funded by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So there's quite a bit at stake here if Congress does its job, and it's our job to make sure that Congress takes action. Some of you who are participating in this webinar already belong to FASEB's e-action list and received a communication yesterday that asked you to send an email to your senators and representatives. If you have not, this link at the top of the screen is one way that you can go ahead and take action. Sending an email really only takes a few minutes, and seriously, we've made it to the point where it's one click to send your messages. If you're not sure who your members of Congress are, this online form allows you to just enter your zip code to go ahead and make sure that you can find and be connected to the right members of Congress. In terms of a couple of hints, you may be asked for your zip code +4 because some congressional districts are very large and you will need that zip +4. In addition, wanted to make sure that folks know that we had a few problems with the system yesterday that we have since resolved. You can customize your message to your legislators. We have, when you click on this form, there's some suggested text, but I really do strongly encourage everyone to add a sentence or two to personalize it with why biomedical research is important to you and why funding for NIH matters to you. And we hope that if we can get enough of these emails to Capitol Hill, they really will start to pay attention. So far, I think we've got about almost 2,700 people who have taken action since yesterday. That's a great start, but we're going to need a lot more than that to make sure that our voice is heard on Capitol Hill. When I mentioned that you can customize your message, you may have a question about, well, what else would I put in other than the pre-written material you've provided? The good news is FASEB has information and resources you can use. One of our most popular resources is our data about federal funding and how much goes to each congressional district and each state. All of our fact sheets are available online. You do not have to be a member of a FASEB society to access them. This screenshot here shows you where to find them on our website. The first thing that I want to draw your attention to is the district fact sheets. So for these would be very helpful as you're writing to your members of the House of Representatives. We do have fact sheets for almost every congressional district, and they provide what I call baseline data about how much federal funding is going to these districts for 4 primary science institutions: the National Institutes of Health, the National Science Foundation, the Department of Agriculture, and the Department of Energy Office of Science. As you'll see on this fact sheet, on the right-hand side, we provide some basic information about the agency in case the person who's receiving this information isn't familiar. And we also provide data on the amount of dollars that are going to the district and how many institutions receive them. This is data that actually comes from federal websites. What FASEB has done is curate it into a more digestible format. So these fact sheets are extremely popular, and we happen to know that NIH Director Francis Collins has told us many times that he uses them when he goes to meet with members of Congress.
All right, so as Jennifer said, the big push we're going for right now is to make sure that everyone contacts their members of Congress to urge them to finish the fiscal year 2017 budget and not leave all those research dollars on the table, so to speak. But we also want to take a few minutes here to talk about additional advocacy resources that we make available to the scientific community and to the public. These are things you might consider to do or consider doing in sort of the medium or longer term. We have this advocacy tools platform. We have a whole slew of sort of tips and information about how you can be an advocate for biomedical research funding. One that you might consider doing, again, in the sort of medium or near term, is to actually meet with your members of Congress or staff in their offices. The first thing I should say about that is some of you might be wondering, well, I don't have the money or the time to travel to Washington, D.C. To meet with my member of Congress. Of course, if you do come to Washington, it would be wonderful for you to go up to Capitol Hill and participate in the democratic process. But barring that, you can actually meet with your members of Congress in your home districts. Every member of Congress, every member of the House, every senator has a district or state office. This is somewhere you can go close to where you live and work and actually communicate with your members of Congress. So should you wish to proceed and do that, really it's a very straightforward process, and it really boils down to 4 easy steps. The first is to, of course, request a meeting in writing, and by writing in the modern age, we of course mean via email. It's important to practice what you will say in the meeting. You're all very familiar with your scientific research, but it's always good to have a very specific message prepared beforehand. The third, and this is, I think, perhaps most important to realize, is that congressional staffers are professionals. They want to hear from constituents, they want to hear your story, and they want to gain your perspective. So really it is about relaxing and having a cordial conversation. And I know that can be sound like a tall order given how partisan things are in the United States these days, but really it should be, particularly with regard to biomedical research funding, an opportunity to have a very polite and productive conversation. Finally, after your meeting, it's always important to follow up, and I'll say a few words about that in a moment. So as I said, on the FASEB website, we have a number of resources to help you request and set up a meeting. We have a sample email letter, as well as information about how to contact your members of Congress. Similar to what we mentioned a few minutes ago about the current e-action alert, we have this Legislative Action Center link on our website. Here you can look up your elected officials, find out not only their email addresses and phone numbers, but also the location of their offices here in D.C. and their offices back home. And when you set up your meeting, we also have a whole set of suggestions about how to conduct your meeting. And I'll just talk about that a little bit right now. So as I said before, when you're speaking to congressional staff members, the important thing is to be prepared. These people, they care about constituents, but they're also very busy. So it's important to, while you should share your personal stories about your science and why it's important, it's also to have a very specific ask. That is to say, what would you like the Congress to do? What would you like to see the agency budgets be? It's of course important to be prepared with regard to the members of Congress as well. Before you meet with any member's office, it's good to know a little bit about them, about what their professional background is, and in particular where they stand on biomedical research. Jennifer already mentioned our state and district fact sheets, as well as our other funding and data and other materials. So all that information is freely available on the web. You should feel free to bring any of that with you to congressional meetings. And as I said, it's important to follow up. If you meet with a congressional staff member, they will, even if they are very receptive to our message, even if they're very much behind biomedical research, they have 1,000 other things going on, and so they can quickly forget. So even a short email message, a line or two the next day after a meeting is incredibly helpful just to keep this issue on their radar. In addition to setting up congressional meetings, we have a whole lot of other ways in which you can connect with FASEB and promote biomedical research. Here's just a small set of sample tweets. We're very active on social media. We encourage you to follow us at FASEB OPA. And please, and whenever you see science funding stories or things that are of relevance to the biomedical research community, we encourage you to engage on Twitter. And we have a whole slew of other tools with which you can really stay engaged. We have our FASEB e-action alerts. These are the ways in which we send out very targeted messages to all of you to make sure you contact your members of Congress to advocate for a particular issue, for example, getting the Congress to pass this year's federal budget. We also produce a biweekly newsletter called the Washington Update, in which we keep everyone abreast of political and other happenings in Washington that are of relevance to the scientific community. And we also are on Facebook, so please follow us there. And we hope to keep you all engaged in advocacy for biomedical research.
So this concludes the formal part of our presentation, and we are now ready to take questions that anyone may have, and we have seen a few come in through the waves here. So Kathy is our moderator. Kathy, do we have questions that have come in so far? Okay. We did get some questions that were submitted to us through the system that you guys used to register for the webinar. So why don't we go ahead and start addressing those. One that came in that I think is probably fairly common, the laboratory or institution where I work is actually represented by a different member of Congress than where I live. Which one should I contact? This is a common question that we get. Some members of Congress only want to hear from their constituents and are very strict about receiving messages from only constituents and no one else. I would recommend that you start with the member of Congress who represents the home district where you live, where your residence is, and sending a note there. If, however, you work in across a county line or in a neighboring state, it's perfectly appropriate to craft a short message to the member of Congress from that state or that county. And you can acknowledge that you work at an institution in their district and are concerned about this issue because of the jobs that it provides and the federal dollars that support the university. But I do recommend starting with your member of Congress who represents your residence area. Another question that's come in is, I have previously visited with my member of Congress or their staff through a Capitol Hill Day sponsored by another organization. What is the best way for me to follow up since I only met with this person for 15 minutes and I haven't heard from them since? This typically happens as well, too, as my colleague Ben mentioned. Aides on Capitol Hill are very busy and it sometimes can feel like you didn't get through, but a follow-up email is a great way to catch their attention. I would advise starting with a very simple thank you at the beginning of the email message. If it has been a couple of weeks or a couple of months since you met with the aide, you can start off with a standard greeting and remind them that you were in to meet with them 3 months ago when you talked about NIH funding. You're now ready to follow up because you understand that Congress is getting ready to vote on the final budget for 2017, and you would really like that member of Congress to vote in favor of the $2 billion increase for NIH. I also recommend trying to keep in touch with any aides or people that you make contact with throughout the year. There is a fine line between being effective and then just becoming a pain. And so what I do recommend is that you communicate when you have some interesting news to share. So if you just found out that you received an NIH grant, or the principal investigator in whose lab you work just was notified, it's perfectly appropriate to contact the aide you may have met with 6 months ago and say, I'm ready to share good news. Our lab got this grant and we are going to be studying cancer research for the next 3 or 5 years. In addition, if you come across some interesting article or data that you want to share with a member of Congress or their staff, it's perfectly appropriate to send them an email with that information. I do, however, caution that simply forwarding journal articles is not very helpful. They are unlikely to get read. So it's a good practice to summarize the main topics or the main conclusions of an article in 2 or 3 sentences, and then you can provide a link to the larger piece. But you want to be able to give them something that they can read on their phone or on their computer screen very quickly.
We had one question come in from a couple of different people on other people's minds. This is much more a logistical question. We presented a lot of information today, and we presented it rather quickly. So the question was, will we be posting this information on the web? The answer is yes. In addition, to making it publicly available, we are also going to send an email to all of you who have registered for the webinar. That email will include links to the presentation and the recordings today. So you will have this information available to you after the webinar ends.
Okay, and we have another question that just came in. Thank you very much, Cassie. Is it important to advocate at the state level with my state assemblies as opposed to just federal representatives? Absolutely. Kudos to whoever asked this question. FASEB focuses on the federal government and the U.S. Congress, but considering that many states provide state dollars for biomedical research and physical sciences research as well, I do encourage you to reach out to your state representatives. And pro tip here, many of the resources that are available on the FASEB website can be repurposed for use in advocacy at the state level. Just substitute the name of your state representative or state senator and the name of the correct committee that's handling that issue, and you should be good to go. From the questions list that came in prior to the webinar, here is a good one, and one probably worth mentioning on this. As a researcher who gets federal funding from the National Institutes of Health, I have always been told and warned that I am not allowed to lobby. Can you please clarify how the lobbying rules relate to my situation? I would love to do that, and I do want to make sure everyone understands that the person who wrote this question is absolutely correct. Federal funds cannot be used to support lobbying of any kind or any lobbying activities, and we do have to be careful. That being said, the recipient of a federal grant or someone working on a federal grant can certainly use their own time and their own funds to lobby. And by that I mean, if you go home after your time in the lab or after your work day, we encourage you to log on to your personal laptop or your personal device and use that to email your members of Congress or connect with your members of Congress. Taking time off of work to participate in a Capitol Hill Day or to arrange a meeting with your members of Congress at home is perfectly appropriate. And sometimes members of Congress will hold activities on the weekend, like a town hall meeting or open office hours or some kind of constituent coffee, it's okay for you to go to that on your own time. The most important thing to remember is that you cannot use any of your federal resources to engage in lobbying activities. So when in doubt, log out of the computer at your desk and go home and use your personal laptop. Ben, I thought we had one more question. Here's one that we actually have heard quite a bit in the last couple of years. My research is supported by federal tax dollars. Won't I sound completely self-serving if I ask my member of Congress to support funding for research that will benefit my career? Actually, that's the quite opposite. You will not sound self-serving. You will sound very well informed. It's really important to remember that the research that you do is not just benefiting you and your career in the lab that you work in. It actually benefits everyone in society. There's a lot of material on the NIH website, for example, that talks about the impact of federal research funding on improving human health and helping to grow the economy and make America a very innovative country. Keep in mind, you're not doing this research for personal gain or benefit. Really, at the end of the day, you're doing it on behalf of the greater good. Scientists really do have a lot of credibility on Capitol Hill, and really, you're the best to explain how federal research dollars benefit you locally, or what the connection is between the university you work at, the federal research dollar, and other activities in your community. While we've heard this claim before, I assure you that most forms of advocacy are being done by people who are arguing for something that really affects them and is important to them. And it's often the most personal plea that's the most persuasive to a member of Congress. Also, rest assured that every other organization and entity and group is out there lobbying and advocating as well, too. So we want to make sure that the voices of the research community are heard on the Hill. Someone has asked for information about proposed NIH budgets. That, again, was here in the webinar, but we can certainly provide some additional information. What happened was this summer, the appropriations committees in the House and Senate passed what's called draft legislation to provide the budget for NIH. The House Appropriations Committee recommended that NIH receive a $1.1 billion increase, and then the Senate went even higher and said, no, NIH really needs a $2 billion increase in 2017. So that's what Congress is trying to resolve right now. Just one of the many things that has to be resolved about the budget is the increase for NIH going to be $1.1 billion or $2 billion. We are hearing that there's a lot of interest in actually providing that higher number. Additional information about the NIH budget and what's in it, the sort of individual line items and the funding for specific diseases and other issues can be found on the FASEB website through our Washington Update newsletter, which is available on the website. If you look at the screen now, that first link will take you to our newsletter. And we also encourage you to sign up for the Washington Update newsletter that comes out bi-weekly and really reports on the latest news from Capitol Hill. We still have a few minutes left, and so I will turn back to some of the other questions that have been submitted before the webinar. And I think I'll get my colleague Ben to join us too for the answers as well. How much detail should I provide about my research when I contact my member of Congress?
So it's important really to be as brief as possible. We recommend no more than 3 sentences. And it's really important also to try to connect your research with a specific disease or health condition. I would, although it can be useful in the academy, in Congress, and in politics, it's best to avoid using scientific jargon or complicated terms. You really want to talk about research in a way that people can connect to and how it really tangibly improves people's lives, if possible. It can be a challenge to communicate with a non-scientific audience, but we really encourage you to try and do your best. In fact, one piece of advice that I've heard before is that if you're speaking to congressional staff members or congressional offices, think about it like as if you were teaching undergraduates. Most of these people are educated, but they don't necessarily have any sort of scientific background.
Great. Another question that came in, and this is great because it talks about the future Congress. My congressman is newly elected. Is there a different approach to a congressional freshman? Actually, yes, and we will provide more information about that in the weeks to come. FASEB is actually preparing a directory of the freshman members of Congress, the newly elected ones, and their viewpoints on science and research funding, and we will be getting that out in early December. In terms of approaching a new member of Congress, it is a little bit different, particularly if they don't have any known background in science or research. If you've looked at their campaign website and they said nothing about how they feel about research or healthcare or that kind of thing, my advice to folks is to find out as much as possible as you can about your new members of Congress. Google is a great resource. Look at their Twitter feeds as well. And if it appears that they have no positions on healthcare or haven't talked about this issue, start with the very basics. What is the National Institutes of Health? Why is federal funding really important for biomedical research? What do you do as a member of the research community? Why are you studying a particular area of research or science? What's the impact either on health or new technologies or new drugs? So take it to a very, very basic level. If you've done your background research and it looks like your new member of Congress may have a little bit of knowledge about what NIH is or what biomedical research is, then you can kind of take it to the next level and be a little bit more specific about what you'd like them to do. In which case you can include some data that says, there is this many dollars federal funding coming to our district. We really would like you as a new member of Congress to continue to support funding because of the jobs it creates at home and the impact on the local community. Another person has asked, what is the White House proposal for the NIH budget? I assume this is in response to President Obama's budget that he released in February of this year. President Obama actually suggested that the NIH budget increase by about $1.1 billion, which is what the House of Representatives ultimately recommended as well, too. We do not know what the Trump administration will propose for NIH. The Trump administration will be doing a budget. Really, it will be for fiscal year 2018, which will begin on October 1 of 2017. We expect the Trump administration budget to come out sometime this winter. I wish I could be more specific. We're hearing different things. I think the earliest it could come out is February. The latest could be as late as May, depending on how quickly they get things together. We are, however, anticipating that there may be some sort of high-level information in early February with some kind of broad overarching budget goals for the Trump administration. Please remember to check back to the FASEB website and the FASEB Twitter feed, because as soon as we get any information about the Trump budget for NIH, we will be sure to share that with the public. Another question that came up, I believe, was about the one comment that President-elect Trump made on the campaign trail, which was, I hear so much about NIH and it's terrible. We are very much aware of this comment. It was made while President-elect Trump was being interviewed on a radio show. We're not entirely sure what he meant by it or where he got that information or who's been talking to him about the National Institutes of Health and why he thinks it's so terrible. So one of the things that FASEB will be doing is preparing a memorandum with policy recommendations for the new administration, and we will certainly seek to correct the record for President-elect Trump that NIH is not terrible and that it is doing good things. So we have been trying to sort of source where that came from, and we've not come up with anything yet. But if we do get more information about the context of that quote, then we will certainly go ahead and provide that and look, again, check back with FASEB's website and our Twitter feed for more information. At this point, it looks like we have maybe a few more pending questions and a few more minutes for this webinar. We said it would go up to an hour. So while we wait for some additional questions to come in, because it looks like they're popping up, let's go to one that came in earlier, and that is, do I have to be a member of a FASEB society to access the FASEB resources when communicating with my member of Congress? The good news for you there is no, you don't. We provide all of this on our website as much as possible, and please go ahead and help yourself to those resources. My colleagues have just submitted one more question. What is the best and most effective way to find out our representatives and senators' history on voting on scientific issues? Again, Google can be your friend. I would start with a couple of different resources on that one. First, go to their website and check their Twitter feed and their Facebook page. More and more members of Congress are explaining their votes or being public about their votes through their social media channels and their regular communications. Also, sign up and read their newsletters. Many will use their newsletter to communicate with their constituents about how they voted on a particular issue. If none of those resources can help you out, then you can certainly go to house.gov and senate.gov. They keep track of every single vote members of Congress take. That can be a little bit harder to use because you have to know which bill they were talking about. and exactly when the vote took place. But one thing that FASEB does like to do is we will try and provide access to voting records as much as possible for members of Congress. So continue to read FASEB materials for information about that as well. Another question that came in is, doesn't it make more sense to advocate for funding in general as opposed to your own specific niche? That is another terrific question. And actually, that could go both ways. Advocating for funding in general is very, very important. But you can use your own research as an example of the type of progress that can be made and the type of research that is federally funded and why the federal dollars are important. So you can certainly start any communication or meeting with an elected official with a general appeal or plea for research dollars, and then tie it back to your own specific issue. One hint I will give is that if you tie your research to a specific disease or condition or even body part, you will certainly catch an elected official's attention or even their staff. Almost everybody has an experience with some kind of disease. That's just unfortunate the way things work. So if you can connect your message and your research to a particular condition, that may be one way to help get your message across. We've received another question about President-elect Trump. Has he made any specific statements that would show his intentions for NIH funding?
Once again, the president-elect has really not said anything specific about NIH funding. Jennifer already mentioned the few comments that he did make about NIH were very general, were quite negative. We don't exactly know where that, what the impetus for his statements was. That said, just to reiterate a point we made earlier, because biomedical research does remain a very bipartisan issue, even in this very partisan time, there is hope that the Trump administration could still be supportive of the NIH budget. We don't know what the new president's budget request will be. As Jennifer said, there will be probably something akin to a sort of vision document, a very, very big picture sort of outline of what the next budget will be. That we expect that to be released sometime in the winter, probably February 2017, and then the full-fledged first budget request of the new administration probably will not be ready until spring, April or May of 2017. It's really at that point that we'll know specifically what kind of numbers NIH, what numbers they'll be proposing for NIH going forward. But for the time being, it does remain an open question.
Thank you, Ben. We've got just about 10 minutes left in the time we allotted for the webinar. I have been through all the questions that were submitted ahead of time, so if you have any more burning questions, now would be a great time to go ahead and submit them. While I wait for those to come in, a new one has come in. I live and work in an area represented by Democrats who are already strongly in favor of research funding and have been quite vocal about that. How should I craft my message to them specifically? Congratulations, this is wonderful. It's always good to live and work in an area where you're speaking to the choir, as they say. We encountered this quite a bit too because of the bipartisan nature of research funding. I would suggest that in crafting a message to someone who's already a supporter, first and foremost, thank them for their support. You can never thank a supporter enough, especially in this environment. A lot of members of Congress are used to getting criticized or hearing negative feedback, so coming in with a positive message is one way to start. Again, personalize that. Explain why you're so grateful and why the people in your community or your state really appreciate the congressman or senator's support for biomedical research. You can also let them know that you're an advocate and you never take anyone's support for granted, so you've also been reaching out to those who have been unclear in their level of support or even those who have been somewhat negative about funding for biomedical research. So never hesitate to let your member of Congress know that you are an advocate and have taken action as well too, and you appreciate their help. You can also ask them if they have particular members of Congress in mind who they think need to hear this message as well too. If you don't live in that state or district, go ahead and look at your contact list and see if you know someone from the research community who does, who could possibly reach out to them. Another question, if there is a continuing resolution for the rest of this year until next September, is the NIH funding the same as the current year? That is a terrific question, and unfortunately the answer is yes. If Congress ultimately fails to do its job over the next month or so and does not pass the 2017 budget, we are hearing that they will simply adopt what's called a year-long continuing resolution, which means that funding for NIH would remain at the 2016 level of about $32 billion all the way through the end of September 2017. So for the next, almost 6 months or so, which is why it's also very critical that we convince Congress that they pass the budget now and not delay this. So yes, the funding would remain flat, and this would be the case for all of the federal agencies as well too. So, and the National Science Foundation would fall in the same area, meaning they would have a flat budget as well too. Another good question coming in: does the president have the authority to cancel the NIH? Not unilaterally. The only way you could cancel NIH or shut it down or stop funding would be for the Congress to pass a bill. And remember that in order for Congress to pass a bill, it must pass both the House and the Senate. Thankfully, nothing has been proposed of that matter. We don't expect anything to happen for that matter. If anything, I think the question regarding the future of NIH will simply be about the budget. How much more will it grow? What kind of research will it fund? What will happen to some of these initiatives that President Obama and his team have been promoting, especially this year, like the Cancer Moonshot? Those are still very much up in the air, but rest assured that no one can unilaterally cancel the authority for NIH. Coming to the end of our questions now. Are there data available about specific members of Congress who may have a specific disease or condition, making them more susceptible to an appeal from an investigator with the right interest? There may be. Again, Google can be your friend. I encourage folks to go to your member of Congress's websites, read their biographies, and see if they mention anything. We do not maintain a list for a number of reasons, privacy being one of them, accuracy being another. So the only way to really find out is if your member of Congress has a particular interest is to either do some research on them or ask for a meeting, and you can certainly ask them, have you had any experiences? Respect their answer if they choose not to respond, obviously, but we do not have a specific database or anything about that. I will say that, again, checking their social media feeds and their Facebook pages for a sense of what they're working on or what events they're showing up at. If they're at the local cancer walk, they may be there for more than just a photo op. They may be there because they particularly care about an issue. So do a little background research, and you should be able to determine whether or not your member of Congress has any kind of disease-specific experience.
So before we wrap up here, I just want to reiterate a point I made before. It's a logistical point. In the coming days, we are going to make all this information available to you. For those of you who are participating today, thank you very much. We really appreciate having you on the line, and we will be, in the coming days, circulating these slides, as well as, I believe, an audio recording. And then subsequently, we will also be posting this information on our website, and I believe also YouTube. So you will have access to all these crucial data in the days ahead. Jennifer?
Thanks, Ben. Thanks to everyone for participating. We hope that you found this to be helpful and informative. If you have any additional questions or need more information, we invite you to send us a note through that communications@faseb.org email address, and we assure you that we will do our very best to get that information to you and to respond to each and every message. So thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. The webinar will conclude now.